You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that share a theme: mind-boggling, unsolved mysteries. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Mommy is in the Trees, and it's about the story that a little girl told police after she was found wandering around a department store by herself in 1985 in Washington State. The second story you'll hear is called Where Did He Go? And it's about the baffling disappearance of Bryce Lispiza. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the 5-star review button to go for a walk with you in northeastern Australia and push them into a gimpy plant. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Mommy is in the Trees. In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the three of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where, 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. And she's just walking around, she looks totally confused, she's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her. basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, Mommy's in the trees, Mommy's in the trees. And so then the police show up, and the grandmother turns to them, and she says, where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana? And the police turn to her, and they're like, we don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot, and she wasn't speaking, and no one knew anything about her, and so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be? And the grandmother's like, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, Mommy's in the trees. And, she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, Mommy's in the trees. And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat, there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so he gets out of there as quickly as he can. And when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow and she had been stabbed 17 times and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, "That looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes." As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found, and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook. And so to the police, they're thinking, Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered, like the FBI. They were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that, we can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because they encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there, that didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike, no one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Steven, unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was, they went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Steven, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. Today, the next and final story of today's episode is called Where Did He Go? In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, "Hey, I want to give you something." And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, "No, I want you to have them." And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, "I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox." And so Sean is like, "I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here?" But Bryce would just say, "Look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you." And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, "Hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim." At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, "Okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me." And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce, Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, "Hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off." And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, "Will you please put my son on the phone?" Bryce picks up the phone and he says, "Hey, Mom," and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, "What's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here?" And Bryce would tell his mom that, "Look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave?" But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing, independent of one another. And so she says, "You know what, Bryce? Look, I want you to just stay there, and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just see what's going on out there." And at this, Bryce immediately says, "No, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here." And so Karen's like, "What do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand." But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead, she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, "Hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here?" And Bryce again just reiterates, "Look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now." And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, "Hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave." And so Kim says, "Okay, I'll give him his keys." And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later, at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side, and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally, his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol, there was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. And Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out, he dialed his mother's number and he hit call, and the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone, the officer picks it up, Karen answers the phone, and the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son, he's just fine, he's sober, there's no drugs, there's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's gonna go home pretty soon, but there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce, Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just got to drive home. You got to leave Buttonwillow. You got to come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you. But Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally, at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank, and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days, but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop. And then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leila and Raymond attended this festival basically every year, and so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leila's son Hal had tried to persuade Leila to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leila said no because Leila and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leila had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leila and Raymond's favorite song came to an end, and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic. And at that point, Raymond and Leila, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leila and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leila helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leila took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leila fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leila's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leila and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leila and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late. And so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leila had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over. And so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock. But when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leela and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was. But as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leela and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leela and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing. I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leela and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leela and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. They checked their phone records, and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate and it came back as belonging to Leela and Raymond. But you got to remember that this police officer was in Arkansas, and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leela and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leela and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leela and Raymond. Leela's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leela, hey, you're driving with your lights off. And Leela would say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry. The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake. And so he just flicked her lights on and said, I'm going to give you a warning. No big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night. And Leela said, thank you very much. Of course, I'll be very careful with my lights. And then actually the officer gave Leela directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas. And then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leela and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself. which meant Leela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But this story about Leela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. Where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory. Our next story is called High Stakes. On October 20th, 1986, Captain Alexander Kluyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing, and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zernov, and he said, "Hey, Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt the landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle. Otherwise, you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed, and to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear. Like, clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle, abort the landing." But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane. And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off, and so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear, the plane skidded all the way down the runway, and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called Baltic Fleet. Around the turn of the 20th century, Russia and Japan got into a dispute over who should be in control of Korea and China. Looking to avoid an armed conflict, the Japanese sent the Russians a deal that came with reasonable concessions on both sides. But the Russians didn't like it, they rejected the deal, and they countered with a pretty unreasonable deal that came with lots of concessions for Japan and not so many for Russia. And so Japan rejected that deal and then promptly launched a devastating surprise attack on the Russian Navy stationed at Fort Arthur in China. This attack would officially start the one-year-long Russo-Japanese War. The Russians knew they would need to send a replacement naval fleet up to Fort Arthur to reclaim it from the Japanese, but unfortunately, the attack at Fort Arthur had totally wiped out all of Russia's best sailors and all their best ships, putting Russia at a major disadvantage to start this war. And so as Russians are wondering what they're going to do next, the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, authorizes an unbelievable mission. He orders the Russian Baltic Fleet to set sail from their harbor in northern Europe and sail 18,000 miles around the world to Japan, where they will defeat the Japanese and then reclaim Fort Arthur. The fact that none of the Baltic Fleet ships were designed to sail that far of a distance, or that there were literally 0 refueling points along their massive projected path, was considered largely inconsequential and ignored. What was also considered inconsequential was how absurdly unqualified the Baltic crew was. The sailors were mostly illiterate peasants that did not grow up on the coasts, and so they showed up for military training with no seafaring skills. And then after their military training, they still had no seafaring skills because the Baltic Fleet's harbor was frozen solid almost year-round. But the Tsar believed the man he had put in charge of this crew, Admiral Rojesvenski, would make up for their deficiencies. And this belief was not unwarranted. Admiral Rojesvenski was the best Russian officer that had not been killed in that Japan surprise attack. He had significant combat experience, and he had a wickedly bad temper. He didn't care who you were. If you were doing something he didn't like, he was going to beat the crap out of you. Literally. And when he was told he was going to be in charge of this fairly inexperienced crew, he was certain his rough style would whip these Baltic boys into shape, and they would be very successful. But when he laid eyes on the Baltic Fleet, he realized this was going to be a little bit more challenging than he realized. In addition to being less than satisfied with his fighting crew, he was equally dissatisfied with the 2 senior officers that were assigned to be his direct support. And he immediately gave them nicknames, and he would only refer to them by their nicknames, right to their face. The first one was the manure sack, and the other was a vast empty space. As for the Baltic Fleet's 45 ships, they were terrible. Because this unit never went out on the ocean because their harbor was always frozen, Russia didn't waste their good ships on them. So all they had were really old, obsolete warships, and then non-military ships like ferries and yachts that they just slapped random guns onto. They also had ships that the Baltic Fleet crew enthusiastically called futuristic, which were these ships that came out of Russia briefly copying French engineering, which involved these crazy top-heavy ships that sat so low in the water that their lowest rung of weapons, their cannons that poked out the windows at the bottom of the ship, they didn't work because they sat under the water permanently. But regardless of their shortfalls, the Baltic Fleet was what Rojesvenski had been dealt, and so he had to just get them moving if they were going to win the war. And so on October 16th, 1904, Admiral Rojesvenski ordered all of his men to take their positions in all of their ships, and they set sail. And immediately, 30 seconds into their trip, the lead ship ran aground, and another ship lost its anchor, even though it should not have been casting its anchor to begin with. And so while one ship is trying to refloat and the other is trying to find its anchor in the ocean, a third ship comes along and broadsides a fourth ship. And it does so much damage to this fourth ship, that ship had to go back home. But once they overcame these initial obstacles, the Baltic fleet that now numbered 44 ships made it out of the harbor without any more issues and then set sail for the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. As they drew closer, Manure Sack informed Rojesvenski that there might be an issue, that he had heard rumblings amongst the crew that they believed Japanese torpedo boats were stationed off the coast of Denmark waiting for them to get there. Rojesvenski told Manure Sack that that was impossible. The Japanese torpedo boats did not have the capabilities to sail 18,000 miles to Denmark, and even if they did have the ability to do that, they could not have gotten there in such a short period of time. But Manure Sack told Rojesvenski that unfortunately, even though logically that makes sense, this rumor had spread all across the crew. And so Rojesvenski began sending out messages to all the other ships, telling them there are no Japanese torpedo boats waiting for us off the coast of Denmark. Everybody just needs to calm down. And these messages did appear to work at first, because eventually another rumor began to circulate, one that Rojesvenski was not really aware of as it was happening, and that was that the crew began to believe there was a huge minefield underneath them. Everywhere they went, there was a minefield. And everybody got so worked up about it that it made its way back to a lot of the captains actually piloting the different ships. And at some point, the pilots just began doing these evasive maneuvers, and Rojesvenski's looking around wondering what they're doing, and they began crashing into each other, trying to avoid this minefield. When Rojesvenski finally figured out what was going on, he sent out even more messages telling them that there's no minefield under us. It's totally safe. Everybody just needs to calm down. And so it took Rojesvenski going out on deck and firing shots into the air to finally get people to stop believing they were on top of a minefield. But just a couple of hours later, after Rojesvenski had gone back up to the bridge and was just looking out, surveying his fleet as they carried on towards Denmark and Sweden, when all of a sudden, towards the very front of his fleet, he heard this unbelievable barrage of cannon fire. One of his own ships was engaging something out in front of the fleet. But Rojesvenski was too far away to see what it was, and then a message came through from the attacking ship, whose name was Kamchatka, and they said they were surrounded on all sides by at least 8 Japanese torpedo boats. And so Rojesvenski runs out onto the deck, looking out towards the horizon, expecting to see these 8 Japanese ships, but he doesn't. And then all of a sudden, the shooting just completely stops, and it's silent. And then Rojesvenski notices on his right side a small little fishing boat is making its way right up alongside his. It would turn out Kamchatka, the attacking ship, had confused this little unarmed Russian fishing ship with 8 Japanese torpedo boats and had opened fire. But luckily, even though they fired hundreds and hundreds of rounds at this little boat, none of them hit the boat, and so the fishermen were fine, and the fishermen had actually been sent to the boat, specifically by Tsar Nicholas II, to tell Rojesvenski that he had been promoted. And so Rojesvenski apologizes to the fishermen for having shot at them hundreds and hundreds of times, and they said it was okay, and the fishermen carried on. After Rojesvenski chewed out the crew of the Kamchatka, the rest of the Baltic fleet gathered up, and they continued towards the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. When they got close, a Danish resupply ship came out to meet them to give them fuel and food and water, and the Baltic fleet mistook them for a Japanese torpedo boat, causing them to ram them repeatedly. And then they realized their mistake, but at that point they had done severe damage to the resupply ship, who had to immediately turn around and go back to shore. After that, the Baltic fleet did manage to get past Denmark and Sweden, and they made it out to the North Sea. But as soon as they got out there was trouble. One of the captains of the ships that was towards the front of the Baltic fleet's formation spotted 4 Japanese torpedo boats coming right at them. And so this ship, along with 6 others, immediately just began engaging these 4 ships with everything they had. Cannons, big guns, small guns, everything. It was absolute chaos from the front of this formation. And the amount of gunfire that was going off towards the front caused the rest of the ships that were not part of the attack to begin to panic. And the other ship captains began ramming into each other to try to get away from this attack. And so while that's going on, all the crew members on all the ships begin drawing their swords and running around, expecting the Japanese to board them at any moment. and the others that did not draw their swords put on life jackets and laid down on their back on the deck of the ship, believing that was procedure for how to survive a sinking ship. And so for the next 20 minutes, it was just continuous gunfire coming from the front of their formation. One of the attacking ships sent a message back to Rojestvensky that said they had been hit by a torpedo and they were taking heavy fire and it was just absolute bedlam up there. And then all of a sudden, it just totally stopped. And when the smoke cleared, Rojestvensky and his ship had been able to maneuver up a little bit closer and they could see what they were shooting at. And it would turn out, once again, it was a case of mistaken identity. They were not being attacked by Japanese torpedo boats. They had spotted 4 small British fishing boats. And in the chaos of the gunfight, the Baltic Fleet had inadvertently begun to fire at each other, killing several crew members and badly damaging their ships in the process. As for the British fishermen, only one of their boats actually sunk, despite the fact that the Baltic Fleet had fired thousands and thousands of rounds at them, and they had been stationary the entire time. The Russian Tsar immediately apologized to Britain, but the British media went crazy and the British people called for war, believing that this type of attack could not possibly be an accident. But Russian diplomats leveled with the British and said, no, this really was an accident. And eventually they convinced them, avoiding starting yet another war. Rojestvensky and his Baltic fleet were allowed to continue in their journey, and after a couple of weeks, they were getting close to Africa when one of his ships, the Kamchatka, the same ship that believed they were surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats, they got separated from the main fleet and got lost. And so Rojestvensky and the other officers did what they could to try to locate them, but nobody had seen where they went, and there wasn't great technology to try to locate them, and so unfortunately, Rojestvensky and the Baltic Fleet just had to continue on and hope that at some point the lost ship would find them again. A few days later, the main body arrived in Tangier, and lo and behold, Kamchatka showed up. And they informed Rojestvensky that they had gotten lost, and they didn't really have a good answer for that. But once they were lost, they managed to engage 3 separate Japanese torpedo boats. But it would turn out they were not Japanese torpedo boats. They were in fact a German, a Swedish, and a French fishing boat. But none of Kamchatka's rounds actually impacted any of the 3 vessels, and so 3 more wars were averted. And so now that Rojestvensky had his lost ship back, he gathered up his full Baltic fleet and they left Tangier. But on their way out, one of the ships managed to cut the underwater telegraph line to Tangier, cutting off Tangier's communication with Europe for the next 4 days. By now, the Baltic fleet was very low on coal, but they had a planned rendezvous with a German resupply ship off the coast of West Africa. When they got there, the crew decided they didn't want to do another resupply later on, and so let's just take double coal this time. And so they hauled all this extra coal onto their ships despite not having a place for it, and so naturally they began throwing it in the halls and in their bedrooms and basically anywhere there was space. And what that did is it led to a fine layer of coal dust all over everything in the ship. And that, combined with the intense humidity off the coast of Africa, led to this black coal gunk getting trapped inside of all of the sailors' lungs, which began killing several of them. A couple weeks later, as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, it finally rained on them, washing away a lot of that coal dust on their ships, which was a big relief. But the rain turned into a pretty bad storm, and so Rojestvensky decided he just wanted all of his ships to call in and say they were okay. And so one by one, each of the ships were told to message him saying the words, "We are okay." And so one by one, each of the ships did this until it got to Kamchatka's turn. And they accidentally sent the message, "Do you see Japanese torpedo boats?" And of course, this message spread like wildfire across the entire crew, which led to mass hysteria, and Rojestvensky's trying to send out messages to say, no, there's no Japanese torpedo boats, but it's too late, the other captains are panicking, and they're ramming into each other and firing blindly into the wind. From that point forward, every night, Rojestvensky would go up onto the bow of his ship, and he would scream obscenities at Kamchatka. When the Baltic fleet finally made it to Madagascar, the morale amongst the crew was very low. And so when they docked in Madagascar, the crew decided it would be a good idea to boost their morale by buying some pets to bring back on board the ship with them. And the pets they decided to bring back were crocodiles and poisonous snakes. When their handlers smuggled them back on board their ship, they immediately escaped down into the bowels of the ship. When they went looking for them, they couldn't find them because the ships were in such bad shape. There were all sorts of cracks and holes all over the interior for these animals to escape to. And so the men just had to accept there were very dangerous predators just living on their ship with them. And so most men were unable to sleep at night in fear of being attacked by these animals, which led a number of them to go for real insane. And so the pets idea didn't really boost morale amongst the Baltic fleet, and so one of the officers decided he would take another crack at boosting spirits. And so he went to a vendor in Madagascar and he purchased 2,000 of their finest cigarettes to bring back on board. So he brings them back on board, he hands them all out, and everyone's so thankful. But it turns out those cigarettes were laced with enormous amounts of opium, which led to hundreds of the crew members becoming hopelessly addicted to opium. Also in Madagascar, the sailors picked up dozens of diseases that began wiping them out in droves. During one funeral for a crew member, the Kamchatka asked if they could fire a salute with blank rounds. They were given permission, but they accidentally fired live rounds into the ship right next to them. When Rojesvenski and the rest of the Baltic fleet finally left Madagascar, their only refrigerator on board one of their ships broke, which spoiled all of their meat, tons and tons of meat. And so they began throwing it overboard, which attracted hundreds and hundreds of sharks, which circled their ships for the rest of their journey. Rojesvenski desperately wanted to find a way to somehow train the remainder of the Baltic fleet how to be somewhat militarily competent. And so he decided he would make them all do target practice because that had been a big issue on this trip so far. And so he had one ship attach a long line that was connected to a target in the water, and that ship would pull the target along, and the other ships would take shots at the target. And so all of the ships on Rojesvenski's call began firing at this target, and after thousands and thousands of rounds, they didn't hit the target once. However, they managed to continuously shoot the ship that was pulling the target. For Rojesvenski, this was the final straw. He felt like he could do absolutely nothing to make the Baltic fleet an actual military force. And so he sent a message back to the Tsar and said, "You gotta replace me. I need to resign and somebody else needs to come in and take over." And the Tsar said, "No, this is your fleet." And so begrudgingly, Rojesvenski continued on leading the Baltic fleet until they finally, after 7 total months on the sea, were within striking distance of their target in Japan. The night before, as they prepared for their attack, they went into stealth mode where all the ships killed all of their lights, so they're totally dark, with the exception of their hospital ship. That kept their lights on. This was considered a rule of war at the time, which both sides abided by. And so while the Baltic fleet was sitting out in the waters outside of Japan, a small fishing boat began coming towards them. Now, the fishing boat could only see the lit-up hospital ship. They could not see the 43 other darkened ships. And so a crew member on board this hospital ship came up to the railing and he recognized the fishing boat was actually a Russian fishing boat. And so he waved them down, and when the Russian fishermen came outside, the crew member told him, "You gotta stop because there's 43 ships behind me that have their lights off. Do not go this way, go around." And so the Russian fisherman thanked him and turned around and went on his merry way. Except that wasn't a Russian fisherman, it was a Japanese sailor on board a Japanese torpedo boat. And now they knew exactly where the Baltic fleet was. And so that night, the Japanese Navy completely surrounded the Baltic fleet, and then the next day at daybreak, they launched their attack. It was called the Battle of Tsushima, and it was obscenely lopsided. The Japanese Navy completely wiped out the Baltic fleet, killing 4,000 of their crew members and capturing 7,300 others, which included Rojesvenski, who had been badly wounded in the battle, but he would survive. In contrast, the Japanese only had 100 casualties. This victory for Japan really marked the end of the war for Russia, and shortly after the Battle of Tsushima, the Russians agreed to surrender.